Hi, and welcome back. This is lecture number 4, and in this lecture we're going to do primarily two things. One, we're going to talk about classroom behavior and note-taking, and then secondly, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about how do you prepare for examinations, how do you take examinations, and more specifically, issues of test anxiety. We'll as well want to discuss briefly how to take standardized tests, such as the ACT, SAT. So first of all, let's go to a discussion of how one should behave in class. In other words, classroom behavior. First of all, I think the first thing we want to point out is that school is the place where we get the help we need for our own learning. I think sometimes this is true of students who I teach. I think sometimes they believe that school is the place where they do things to me. Where they do things to me. We've really got to stop this. We've got to stop thinking about how the teacher is making me do this and school is a bad place for me. And we need to begin to think about school as the place where I do things for myself. Does that make sense? That's what we want to begin to think about school as. If you are to learn, you've got to be able to use your classroom time with the teacher to the best advantage. So the number one word, and I've already used it once with us, the number one word in class is focus. We're going to come back to this several times. You've got to be able to focus while you're in class with the instructor. Now, think about what we've already said about learning journals, and this will make sense to some degree. We read before we come to class. Back to the math example, 7.1, chapter 7.1. When we come into class, we already have some idea of what's coming. Remember, that's called being prepared. And we already are showing up with some idea of questions and things like that maybe we want to have addressed for us by the teacher. I like to think of teachers as helpers, and that's really why we are showing up. So in other words, that's no throwaway line when a teacher says at the end of an equation, a sample equation, any questions. That's not a throwaway line. That's a real question for a serious student. If you don't understand the second time through, remember the first time through will be the night before in your own study or the morning before in your own study. The second time through then will be the instructor giving the information. If you still don't get it, now's the time to ask some questions. We want to arrive to class then early. We want to show up always on time, and we always want to be prepared. I recommend always having notebooks. For each class, or one large notebook for all of your major core classes in terms of academic classes. Show up early and make sure that you have your learning journals open and ready to go. You want to sit in a place as well where you can focus. I have seen students who were themselves pretty good students, but they were able to become too distracted by people around them. And we want to be sure that we're sitting where there's not a tremendous amount of distractors and one is able to focus specifically on the information. You will notice oftentimes as a student when you're sitting in class, especially if it's a long lecture or something's happening over a period of the usually 45 to 50 minutes, how long classes go, you will find yourself sometimes with your mind wandering, kind of going away, and then you've got to bring yourself back. You want to sit somewhere where you can focus the best. Always showing as well respect to both the teacher as well as to students. This is as well significant. And of course, you want to sit up and pay attention. I have found that oftentimes students who lean forward a little and nod their head, even though I'm not sure that they're getting the idea, are students that I want to teach more to as an instructor. And I think this is true of most teachers. If you agree with an idea, you should maybe lean forward and nod. If, however, the teacher is presenting information you don't completely understand, to just give the teacher a kind of look like, I don't quite get that, might be enough of a code. They understand you're listening, they just understand you didn't quite get the concept that time. That is as well important. I always recommend that when you come to class in your pre-class learning journals, that you always have at least one question that you can ask the instructor. And if you feel like that's a question that you want to ask, then go ahead and let the instructor know, I don't quite understand this. It's a good idea. The other issue, obviously, now about what we do in class is the kinds of notes that we take. What specifically should be the types of things that we are doing in class? Most students really aren't very sure what types of things they should be doing in class. Should they be writing everything down that the teacher says? Should they be, trying to get every little nuance? And the answer to that is simply no. An instructor is always going to give way more information than you can ever transcribe right down onto the page. This is especially true in high school and early college courses. So what we're really wanting to do is trying to get the notes that we really need. Here, what I like to say is we have to be selective in our note-taking. Now, we've already mentioned this to some degree because our pre-class reading information will help set us up for primarily the matching information and the new information that we want to understand. Our goal, again, just to say it one more time, is to keep our head up. We miss too much if our head is down and we're constantly trying to write everything down. For example, you will find often that an instructor in mathematics will actually present from Chapter 7, Section 7.1, will actually present on the board the very sample question from the book that you copied down the evening or the morning before in your pre-class learning journals. Therefore, you don't even have to write anything down. Sit back and just watch the instructor work through the same equation that you did the night or the morning before. Okay? I want to give some now suggestions for improved note-taking for those of you who already do a pretty good job of it. First of all, you have to learn to know your teacher well. Understand how they present information. If the primary form is in lecture, then you want to try to understand the order that the information is being presented. If an instructor is going to go to Chapter 7, Section 7.1, it's not a bad idea if you already know in advance that that's where the instructor is going so that you can, and this is key in good note-taking as in good learning, anticipate what's coming next. Good students are always doing this, and of course this drives elementary teachers crazy because as they read the story, what do good students always do? They're always jumping, oh, I know what happened. Okay, this is what good students do. We know that good students are always anticipating. We call this in reading strategy predicting, and we do a lot of predicting when we read actively. Good students take notes predicting. Where's the instructor going with this information? If I've done my pre-class reading journals correctly, I should know if the instructor follows that information along. The other thing I'd recommend that you think about doing is developing your own code system for your learning journals. This allows for you to be able to say, with real abbreviated notes, specifically what you want to remember, what you want to mark as match, what you want to mark as new information. Take a look at the example that I'm providing here for you and watch how my student has done, first of all, the learning journals pre-class, and then during class is taking notes. We're looking here at some mathematics instruction. You will notice, first of all, that you have, in red ink, you have your pre-class reading information. Notice you have your other information on the right-hand side of the page, blue or black ink. This is obviously new information. The way that we know it's new information, of course, is that it will have been marked as match on the left-hand side. What has happened in this lecture is that the instructor has given new equations, not the one from the book. However, notice something interesting what the student has done. She will take her black ink pen and make a note from her pre-class reading journals, and then she will draw an arrow down to the bottom of the page to kind of extrapolate or extend beyond what was in the textbook. Here we have match information and new information going together. Notice as well across the page, just to point it out, that we have exam prep information as well. The student is already considering, how will I prepare for the exam in this learning journals approach? This all now is an example of how to do this type of note-taking and code language. And this code language is very unique. Find your own approach and then use it. I think the other thing that I would like to point out has to do with new information. We have to be able to decide how important new information is the instructor is presenting to us. We want to know if the information is just kind of an interesting little story that they're telling in history class, or is it something that is in fact going to probably end up on the exam? Of course, freshmen in high school love to ask that question, is this going to be on the exam? Unfortunately, this question is code language to mean this is the only information that I'm going to write down. But this is really a pretty good question. We'd like to ask, Is this going to end up on the exam when new information is there? We just might not want to always ask the instructor. Anything that we feel is going to be, yeah, maybe it will end up as new information on the exam, that we want to make sure that we place in our note-taking on the right-hand side. I think the other thing I've already said to you is I would recommend that you always come to class with at least one good question that you would like to ask. And then make a note here. I would always recommend that this question somehow help you connect some kind of new information with some kind of old information. Does that make sense? So that you're trying to learn while you're taking notes. Go back to lecture 1. That was our key. How can I learn? Connect new information to old information to get information that I can prepare for exams for. And that's where we're going next. Because the understanding is, if I am taking in-class notes, typically what I'm doing is I am preparing for the exam. See, we began our whole Learning Journals approach with the assumption that I am gaining information I can use. I am learning and reading so that I can respond to exams. And so we have to talk now about the important issues of exam preparation. We already understand what we've said, that good athletes understand the importance of preparation. Just like athletes know, you do your most important work in the off-season. That's where state championships are won. We understand that it's not the recital where one begins to do their important work. It's what we do prior to the recital, and that's how we know whether a student has in fact been practicing or not. It all kind of comes out in the wash, if you will. And so what we want to make sure we understand is that we have to always be prepared for the examination before we come in. I'm going to end this lecture talking about exam anxiety, test anxiety. The number one cure of test anxiety is to know the material so well that when you show up, you're ready. If you have questions, you lack academic confidence, then obviously the anxiety is going to rise for you. There's no doubt about it. You will want to use the back side of the Learning Journal page on the double-page spread for your exam preparation. Lots of students do this different ways, but my recommendation is that on that double-page spread there, at the top of the page, you have exam prep. This is why you will never write on the back page of your learning journals. You will always go to the next page. Login information then will be 1 next to the login information for the first page of maybe section 7.1. And if you have to continue your learning journals, then you would go to a completely separate sheet of paper with 7.1.2 and then circle, so that you always leave the back side of the page as a double-page spread for any exam prep. We saw a few moments ago the training journals, the learning journals that will show the pre-class reading and the note-taking, and we also took a look at the exam preparation page. If we want to look back at that page for a second, we will notice that what the student is doing there is trying to decide what will be the primary information provided there. Notice as well there are several suggestions that I will make later that this student is doing. Writing down possible essay questions, coming up with possible multiple choice style or short answer style questions. What could the teacher ask? This will be for us one of our major questions. What will the teacher ask? And to this degree, of course, we're going to try as much as possible, think like a teacher. Okay? We want to know the important elements of what to expect. We have to know several things. 1, what type of exam will it be? For example, if the examination is totally essay, that's one style of preparation. If, however, there's multiple choice, if there's true-false, if there are short answers, there may be some different types of memorization that I have to do. The key to preparation, of course, is early study. Now, I'm going to talk with you in Lecture 7 about the master schedule, and it will be there that we know how to prepare even better for long-term master schedule issues. If we have an exam on Friday, we certainly want to begin our preparation Monday, Tuesday. I mean, that only makes sense. The earlier we can prepare, the better. I'll come back to that concept. The other thing that's always interesting to remember, and many students will remember sometime in their middle school or high school years writing down a cheat sheet because they decided they were going to finally borrow answers or cheat this way, and then all of a sudden find themselves not needing it simply because they wrote the information down. I've heard many students tell this to me. We obviously are going to try and prepare for examinations to some degree this way. We will have information written down. If, for example, we know that it's an essay-styled examination, we might even write several potential essay questions in preparation. I want to talk for a few seconds about group study and exam prep. We know that good students study in groups. This is true. There's all kinds of research to demonstrate that when students get together, if they do it well, and I'm going to talk about how we do that well. If it's done well, group study can be a dynamic learning experience as opposed to simply sitting in a library or at home studying alone. To get together with other students and say, what does this idea mean to you? How does this work? Can you help me figure out this equation? It really does make a difference in exam preparation. But there's a few things that I want to suggest. The first is you got to be well organized. For group study to really work, the group has to be together and has to be organized. You want to meet at least twice a week. Here's why. Good groups demand some camaraderie. You got to get together. It's just like a team. If you only meet once or twice a month to play together as a team, you're probably not going to play together as well as if you meet regularly. So I recommend that you try to get together at least 2 times a week. You want to begin, and this is key, begin every group meeting with some written objectives. In other words, what are we going to accomplish in this meeting? 1, 2, 3, 4. Write them down. One of the reasons, of course, is that we find ourselves socializing in our groups. Now, that's not entirely bad, and I'll talk more about that in my later lectures when I talk about important learning that takes place not just in the classroom. But when it comes time to study, we want to make sure that we are specifically going to information. And we can do that if we have it written down and then maybe mark it off as we do it. In other words, what problems did you have? What problems did you have? Write that information down. Set some kind of plan of attack. Then I would recommend that you will divide up the workload. So some students will be working with certain kinds of maybe deciding what types of questions, maybe a multiple choice question or two they would make up. A couple of students may be generating possible essay-style questions for an exam. Everyone's studying together. You always want to end each meeting as well with some kind of plan for the future. Okay, we met on Tuesday. When will we meet again? Let's meet Thursday. And what would we like to cover? Let's cover this, this, and this. If you do it this way, maybe everyone by that point will then have the reading done, which is obviously an advantage. Look, group study does nothing for a student who simply shows up to get the answers. Okay, or didn't read the story and so shows up and says, tell me what the story was about. Not only is this really not much help to the student themselves, it's not much help to the other people in the group. So it's kind of important, if possible, the ideal group would be that everyone is doing learning journals. That should make sense. If everyone was doing learning journals in the classes that you would be discussing in your group work, then obviously you would have a point of reference. We all come together, we all have our objectives written down, and we make our group meetings then dynamic. Now, this really does work, and students who take seriously group study as they move on to university already have learned how to get together to study. We know that good students at universities study in groups, no doubt about it. One of the problems many high school students have is they're really good in groups, but not study groups. They're good in other kinds of groups. Okay, let's talk for a few seconds about taking examinations, because there's several things that are of importance here. First of all, we want to understand the basics of exam construction. Usually, teachers are going to employ exams to determine if students understand basic concepts. Unlike how most ninth graders in high school think math teachers make up tests just so they can flunk me, the truth is what really is going on here is the teacher wants to know, I have taught this information from 7.1 of the math textbook. Did the students understand? Most of the students. So we want to understand that's really the value of an examination. At the early levels, of course, most exam construction is really kind of simple recall stuff. In other words, this is the word, do you remember what its definition was? However, later on, at advanced levels, oftentimes what you will see happening is that teachers will ask students to manipulate or use information. Of course, if we've learned the information, we can do that. If we haven't, we're going to struggle. Proper exam prep, obviously, is the key to test anxiety. If you know the match information in your learning journals and you know the new information in your learning journals, what can they ask you that you are unprepared for? The answer most of the time is nothing, which ought to give you some confidence going in. But there are some good suggestions that I can make to you about how to take tests in general. First of all, if you are a good active reader, then you will be able to be a good test taker. There are two important concepts for successful exam prep. The first is time management. In other words, you've got to know how much time is given to an examination. And the second is energy conservation. You don't want to spend too much energy on a single item on the test and then neglect all of the others, find yourself at the end having to rush to try and get through. You always want to begin an examination by what I call scanning the exam. You always want to sit down and take a look at what is on the exam. Too many students, when they receive the exam, the first thing they do is, wham, go right to the test. They'll start on item 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then they hit 8. And they go, whoa, 8 is hard. They work through 8 for a while and then turn the page only to realize there's 25 questions on this test. They got 8 minutes left. Now what are they going to do? We always begin by scanning the examination, looking for number of problems and type of problems asked. You want to try to predict, how much time is this going to take me? How much time do I need to give to each problem? Let's take a look for a second at a couple of exams. I will show the exam to you, and I want for you to just look at a couple of strategies we might want to use. First of all, let's take a look at a calculus test offered by one of my colleagues at Worland High School. When I asked him about this examination, he said, this is an interesting exam. First of all, if a student were to just begin at the very beginning, they would probably not finish. And I said, really, why? And he said, if you'll take a look at the exam, and it's now in front of you on the screen there, you will notice that exam item number 2 is divided up into several components, okay? Each of these components are worth 5 points. So then a student obviously would want to begin with exam question number 2. Let's take a look at another test that I have brought in, again offered by one of my colleagues at Worland High School. This is from the English department. And take a look. This is a normal little quiz. Notice that we have several multiple choice to begin with, 1 through 14. But then notice that 15 and 16, brief essay. Notice 17 and 18, brief essay. 19 and 20, brief essay. Strategy here is obviously extremely important. We want to scan the test. We want to figure out exactly how much time we should be giving to each one of the items and then work through the most difficult first. We also, of course, want to think about how to take standardized tests. Now, what are standardized tests? Standardized tests, SATs, ACTs, are tests which cover knowledge accumulated over time, and therefore cramming for these kinds of tests is really a waste of time. The key in a standardized test for an SAT, ACT is to make sure you are comfortable with time. I strongly recommend that you wear a watch, and if your watch has a countdown timer, use it, okay? Countdown timers allow for you to know if there are 20 minutes allowed for this section. You begin to work through this section, and then you can always check your watch quickly to know how much time is left. That's the value of the countdown timer. I only have 11 minutes left. I have 11 items left. I'm going to have to work through the last 11 items fairly quickly. You don't want to get hung up on just one of the questions that are asked in a standardized test. You want to conserve your energy. Taking several what I call sweeps of the tests are a way for you to make sure you get all of the major information answered. You want to first of all work through the section you are working on for the standardized test quickly, answering questions that are easy for you. If you don't know the answer immediately, you just simply want to circle the number and move on to the next one. At the end of the first sweep then, you should have answered all of the easy, what you will call easy items. You will leave those alone and never come back to them. Then secondly, you will take a second sweep of the test, and here obviously you are looking for those items which you think you probably can't answer. It's just going to take you some time. Again, you want to reference your time. If you can, you want to make sure that you can get through all of those items. The other important thing here, of course, is to know if you're penalized for guessing. If you are penalized for guessing, then obviously you don't want to do it. If, however, you're not penalized for guessing, well, obviously do it. Who knows, you may get the answer correct. You always as well want to make sure to mark the answer sheet correctly. I can't emphasize this one enough. When students start to fatigue, get tired, They will oftentimes write the correct answer in the booklet, but then not transpose it correctly onto the answer sheet. It's a big deal. The other thing is, of course, students oftentimes outthink themselves on a standardized test. They think too much about any given answer and they have problems. I strongly recommend that you not do a lot of changing of answers. That in fact what you instead do is make sure that you feel comfortable with the answer that you've given and then leave it as it is. I would obviously get some good sleep the night before you take a standardized test. Obviously get some good meal the night before you come. Test taking for standardized tests is major time consumption, energy consumption. And when you finish, you are fatigued like you've run a race. That's what you feel like. And so preparation is obviously important there. Okay, let's talk in the last few minutes about test anxiety. I believe that taking tests is a skill, just like doing anything else well in school is a skill. Unfortunately, a lot of students don't give themselves the opportunity of learning how to take tests because they either will cheat through their tests or they will just not take them that seriously. And then as they move up, they find themselves needing to take tests well, and then all of a sudden they haven't really learned how to do it. So it is a skill. The more you do it, I believe, the better you're going to get at it. If you have prepared properly, okay, and you come in to take the test, you ought to be able to know that you can do fairly well. I make this recommendation, and I recommend this certainly for any test that you would be taking. Anytime you receive the test, notice, look around the room, what is it most students do immediately? They immediately start answering the test. Some students, if they're even good students, they will maybe be scanning the test. My recommendation is to take the test, set it on the table, lean back, and take a full 60-second, 1 full minute break. Sit and just shut your eyes and relax. If you have done the pre-class reading, learning journals correctly, if you have done note-taking where you have proper match information, proper new information outlined, if you have done proper exam prep, both individually as well as group, if you've worked through then all of what you believe to be the primary concepts and you know that's what's on this exam, all you have to do is relax and let your mind do what it was created to do. Therefore, taking a minute will focus you, and you can coach yourself. Okay, you've done what you've got to do to get ready. Now let's just do it. Turn the test over. 1, scan the test quickly to know number of items and type of items. Take a look at how much time you have left for you for the exam. If you're writing an essay, obviously you want to give yourself some time to be able to finish and then maybe even make some editing comments, at least cruise through the paper a couple of times to see if you can find any grammar errors. Notice one more time, tests are tools. They are not for torture. Okay? Calculus teachers don't give torture chamber tests. The tests are there to help you understand the concept, which is again why a warrior and a scholar, a top student, can have the exam and the key right next to them and they will never look at it for this very reason. They want to know, did I learn the information? And now finally, in regards to test anxiety, I'd like for you to think about how important it is that after an examination is completed and you receive your examination back, most students look for the grade. Good students look for specifically what they missed. Most good students know what they've already missed. They already know because their exam preparation failed in one area. If you miss on an exam, it's extremely important that you go back to the instructor, that you sit down and you say, how can I make sure I understand this concept? Good students will ask instructors for more items on their own to make sure they understand the concept before they move on. This is what good students do. And we know that test taking and test anxiety will decrease as preparation increases. Our challenge for ourselves, remember the bike example, is to not give up. If we bomb on a test, we find better ways to improve in the future. And the better we do that, the more successful a student, obviously, we're going to be.